January 21st, 1944. The outskirts of Anzio, Italy. The air smelled of iron and smoke. Artillery flashes painted the night sky red as the thin canvas walls of the field hospital trembled with every distant blast. Inside, beneath a single flickering bulb, Nurse Lieutenant Claire Whitmore pressed her gloved hand against the chest of a young soldier. His skin was pale, waxen, the color of paper soaked in moonlight. The medical officer beside her shook his head. "No pulse," he whispered, but Claire didn't move. Around her, the ward was chaos. Stretchers stacked against the wall, morphine nearly gone, blood bags labeled O, A, and AB lying empty. The refrigerator had stopped working hours ago when the generator died. She knew the rules. You never cross blood types, not even in desperation, not even when death was seconds away. She looked down again. The soldier's dog tag read James Rowe, 19. She made her choice. She turned to the next cot, to a still-breathing man of another type, and whispered, "God forgive me." Then she drew his blood. It was the kind of act that could end her career, or save a life thought already gone. The kind of defiance that would quietly change battlefield medicine forever. In the early years of World War II, blood was as critical to survival as ammunition, and often just as scarce. The war had turned Europe into a continent of the wounded. From the beaches of Dunkirk to the deserts of North Africa, men were dying not only from bullets, but from blood loss, infection, and shock. In 1939, a British medical officer wrote in his report, "We have the tools to fight disease, but not the means to keep men alive once they bleed." Before the war, blood transfusion was still a fragile science. Compatibility tests were slow, refrigeration unreliable, and donor blood spoiled quickly. Most field hospitals were equipped with glass bottles, rubber tubing, and little else. The concept of blood banks had only begun a few years earlier, during the Spanish Civil War, when doctors like Frederic Durand-Jourda experimented with stored blood for mass casualties. But global war demanded something far beyond what the laboratories of peace had prepared for. By 1940, the Allies had realized that conventional blood donation systems could not keep up with the front lines. The British launched the Blood for Britain campaign, collecting thousands of bottles from civilians and shipping them across the Atlantic. In the United States, Dr. Charles Drew, a brilliant African-American surgeon and researcher, developed large-scale methods to separate and store plasma, the clear liquid portion of blood. Plasma did not require refrigeration, could be dried and reconstituted with water, and could be used on anyone, regardless of blood type. It became a miracle of logistics, the first true global medical supply line. Yet plasma was not perfect. It stabilized the wounded, yes, but it could not replace oxygen-carrying red cells. Men revived by plasma often slipped away hours later, their hearts unable to recover. On the front, doctors needed something more immediate, something they could use in the chaos of triage tents and field hospitals, a direct transfusion from one living body to another. That demand forced a quiet evolution of wartime medicine. Medics and nurses, working under the roar of artillery, learned to improvise. They used soda bottles when glass flasks broke, siphoned blood by gravity when pumps failed, and sometimes, when all else failed, took blood from any available donor, no matter the type. These acts were rarely recorded. Regulations forbade them. The military command feared that uncontrolled transfusions could kill more men than they saved. Blood incompatibility could trigger violent immune reactions, the destruction of red cells, the clogging of kidneys, and sudden death. The Geneva medical protocols were clear. Every transfusion must be type-matched and tested. But in the reality of the front, where dozens of men could bleed out in an hour, rules were luxuries. In North Africa, British nurses at Tobruk began experimenting with direct cross-type transfusions out of necessity. In the Pacific, American corpsmen discovered that type O blood, the so-called universal donor, could sometimes save soldiers even without a match. But there were exceptions, unpredictable reactions, unexplained survivals. Medical journals back home quietly debated these reports, but on the battlefield, the debate wasn't academic. It was human. For many, these desperate measures were the only thread between life and death. Some lived, some didn't. But every time a nurse risked that forbidden exchange, the science of medicine crept a little closer to understanding what the textbooks had missed. By 1943, as the Allies prepared to invade Italy, mobile surgical units were being stationed closer to the front than ever before. They were manned by surgeons, anesthetists, and nurses trained not only in medicine but in endurance, working in mud, in blackout conditions, often under shell fire. They carried the newest field innovation: dried plasma kits, stamped with U.S. Army Medical Department. But still, in many hospitals, the ratio of wounded to staff was catastrophic. 1 nurse to 30 or more men. Under those conditions, moral judgment often outweighed protocol. It was here, amid the ruins and rubble of Italy's war-torn fields, that the unwritten rules of life and death were challenged, not by generals, but by the hands of the nurses who refused to let men die quietly. And it was here that one of them, faced with a lifeless 19-year-old soldier, made the choice that no manual could justify, and no superior would ever officially condone. By the winter of 1943, the Italian campaign had become a war of attrition, a grinding advance through mud, mountains, and misery. From Salerno to Cassino, the fighting left tens of thousands of wounded scattered across makeshift hospitals carved into church basements, barns, and tunnels. Supplies rarely arrived on time. Electricity was unreliable. And blood, the one thing every life seemed to depend on, was almost always running out. For the medics and nurses stationed there, this was not the clean, ordered medicine of textbooks. It was raw, brutal, and improvised. The battlefield nurse had to think like a soldier and act like a surgeon. Every decision carried the weight of a man's heartbeat. A slip of judgment could mean death, yet so could hesitation. Military medicine in World War II was built on hierarchy. Doctors commanded, nurses obeyed. Orders flowed down, never up, and written into those orders was an uncompromising rule: never mix blood types, never administer unverified transfusions. Violating it could result in court-martial, dismissal, or worse, the death of a patient, recorded in official reports as human error. But in the field, there was often no time to wait for verification. Blood typing kits froze in the cold. Labels came loose in transport. A wounded soldier might have minutes before slipping into irreversible shock. In those moments, nurses learned to read the body, the color of the lips, the slowing pulse, the shallowness of breath, and to decide whether the risk of doing nothing outweighed the risk of breaking the rules. The nurses who served under the Allied Medical Corps were some of the most disciplined and resilient personnel of the entire war. Many were women barely in their 20s, trained in emergency care, but thrust into chaos that no training could prepare them for. They slept little, ate less, and learned to ignore the screams echoing from nearby operating tables. They also learned another unspoken truth. Sometimes, survival required disobedience. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, as Allied forces pushed north through Italy, reports began to surface. Unofficial, whispered, of unorthodox transfusions. They never appeared in official medical logs, but circulated through field channels, letters, and oral accounts. Stories of soldiers revived after being declared gone, of nurses who mixed blood from incompatible donors and watched, stunned, as the dying breathed again. To the military establishment, such stories were dangerous. The science of transfusion was still evolving, and the margin between success and catastrophe was razor thin. Yet, behind closed tents and beneath the roar of artillery, frontline medicine was evolving faster than any headquarters directive could follow. These experiments were not born of ambition, but desperation. The Allied medical system had designed strict separation between blood transfusion units and surgical teams. The units collected, stored, and distributed verified blood, a chain of command that worked only when infrastructure held. But in the chaos of Italy's shattered roads and bombed supply depots, those chains broke. The transfusion units were often miles away, and by the time they arrived, men had already died from loss of blood. And so, nurses began taking matters into their own hands. A small number carried improvised kits, glass bottles sterilized over open flames, rubber tubing, clamps made from salvaged metal. They drew blood directly from one soldier's vein and fed it into another's. The method was crude but immediate, and in many cases, astonishingly effective. The phenomenon wasn't confined to Italy. In Burma, Australian medics were known to perform buddy transfusions using similar improvised systems. In the Pacific, Navy nurses used makeshift tubing when pumps jammed. All of them knew the risks. But war has a way of making moral clarity out of medical doubt. Each of these moments, undocumented, unrecognized, often unspoken, built the foundation for what modern trauma medicine would later become: rapid response transfusion, blood substitutes, and field resuscitation protocols. What began as forbidden improvisation would, within a decade, become doctrine. In 1944, on a rain-soaked night near Anzio, that shift would come into sharp focus. It would not begin with an order or a laboratory experiment, but with a nurse, exhausted, half-starved, staring down at the motionless body of a 19-year-old soldier, and choosing defiance over obedience. Her decision was not the first of its kind, but it would become one of the most unforgettable examples of courage under impossible conditions. There are many ways to tell the story of a war, through battles, weapons, generals, or strategies. But sometimes, the real turning points happen quietly, far from the maps and medals. This story is one of those moments. To understand it, we must see it through several angles: human, tactical, technological, each revealing what it meant to fight death itself with nothing but instinct and courage. The first is the human angle. Nurses in World War II were trained to follow orders, but their reality was different from any regulation manual. They lived in perpetual exhaustion, 20-hour shifts under canvas tents, hands cracked from cold, eyes burning from kerosene fumes. The smell of blood and disinfectant was constant, and the sound of men calling for mothers or priests never truly stopped. Yet, amid that horror, there was a fierce tenderness. Many wrote later that the hardest part wasn't death. It was watching life slip away while bound by rules that forbade trying everything. For someone like Nurse Lieutenant Claire Whitmore, whose story mirrors dozens of real nurses across Italy and France, the line between duty and defiance blurred every night. She had seen soldiers wake up after being pronounced dead, and others die despite every effort. Those experiences carved a kind of cold clarity. Regulations saved reputations, but risks saved lives. Then there was the tactical angle. Battlefield medicine was logistics as much as healing. The success of an operation depended not only on ammunition and fuel, but on blood. Literally, the fuel of the body. The Allied Medical Corps learned that victory on the ground required victory in the tents. Every hour lost to indecision meant another life gone. In the Italian campaign, casualty rates were staggering, sometimes exceeding expectations by hundreds. The chain of evacuation, from frontline aid post to field hospital to evacuation unit, was stretched thin. Supplies were calculated for an ideal scenario, not for the brutal chaos of Anzio. blood shipments spoiled in transport or were destroyed by bombing. Commanders demanded answers, but the nurses and surgeons on the ground could only improvise with what remained. Improvisation became survival. They filtered morphine through socks when sterile gauze ran out. They sterilized instruments in boiling tea water. They used glass jars from rations to store saline. And when they had no blood of the right type, they gambled. It was not madness. It was logic under fire. The logic that doing nothing guaranteed death, while doing something, anything, offered a chance. The technological angle was the hidden backbone of this defiance. The war had pushed medical science forward faster than ever before. Plasma, synthetic substitutes, even early cryogenic storage methods were being tested. Laboratories in London, Washington, and Toronto worked day and night to refine plasma that could be shipped worldwide. Yet, for all this progress, the front lines still lagged behind. Technology was often months away from where it was needed. The soldiers bleeding out on stretchers didn't have time to wait for innovation to catch up. In that gap between invention and necessity stood people like Whitmore, bridging science with instinct. She knew enough to understand the risk. Incompatible blood could destroy a man from within. But she also knew something no regulation could quantify: that sometimes the human body defied prediction, and that the will to live could push the limits of medicine itself. Her act wasn't the product of recklessness, but of quiet calculation. She had seen two men of similar build, similar complexion, one breathing shallowly, the other nearly gone. She had enough medical training to understand their blood volumes, enough experience to know time had run out. Her gamble wasn't blind faith, it was informed desperation. The success that followed, a faint pulse where there had been none, would ignite both admiration and fear among her peers. Because in that instant, she proved that what was forbidden might also be possible, and that realization would ripple through the corridors of war medicine, forcing doctors, commanders, and scientists to confront the question they had avoided since the war began. Was it safer to obey the rules, or to break them in the name of life? The story's second layer begins with leadership and ethics, the silent war within the war. In every military hospital, the chain of command was ironclad. Surgeons reported to medical officers, nurses to matrons, matrons to commanding staff. Each role was vital, yet deeply constrained by discipline. When reports of unauthorized blood transfusions began surfacing, whispered between medics, buried in letters home, they stirred quiet alarm among senior officers. For the medical command, such defiance represented chaos. If one nurse could overrule protocol, then the entire system of wartime medicine could unravel. Yet the field hospitals were not laboratories. They were places of triage and terror. Every decision had to balance morality with military order. To the nurse standing in the mud beside a dying soldier, procedure meant something different than it did to a colonel in an office miles away. What the hierarchy saw as insubordination, the field saw as humanity. Ethically, it was a collision of two duties: the duty to follow rules and the duty to preserve life. Most nurses did not see themselves as rebels. They were pragmatists caught between science and conscience. Many carried quiet guilt for the lives they could not save because they obeyed. Others carried guilt for those they had tried to save and lost because they disobeyed. Both were forms of sacrifice that rarely made it into official histories. In one confidential U.S. Army Medical Department memorandum from 1944, an unnamed field surgeon wrote, "The nurses in forward stations are taking decisions beyond their authorization. We condemn it in writing, but understand it in silence." It was a rare admission. That courage on the front often came dressed as disobedience. The enemy angle adds another mirror. While Allied nurses risked punishment for breaking transfusion rules, Axis medical teams were running their own parallel experiments, often under vastly different moral codes. In German military hospitals, scientists such as Ernst Holzluner and Sigmund Rascher were conducting brutal hypothermia and blood loss experiments in concentration camps, seeking methods to revive pilots and soldiers. These were acts of cruelty disguised as science, or human lives were treated as expendable data. In contrast, Allied medicine, despite its errors and limits, was built on an ethical core, saving life, not exploiting it. Yet both sides were chasing the same mystery: how to bring back the dying. Where the Nazis turned to torture, the Allies turned to courage, instinct, and compassion. The forbidden act of a single nurse at Anzio carried more humanity than all the laboratories of the Reich combined. There was also a moral angle, the quiet reckoning that followed every success and every failure. In letters written after the war, several nurses confessed that their choices haunted them for years. "We didn't know if we had saved him or killed him," one wrote. "All we knew was that he opened his eyes." That moment, a flicker of life where there had been stillness, was enough to justify the risk. The world would later celebrate the engineers, the generals, the strategists, but the unsung heroes of medicine, those who challenged the very manuals written to guide them, were rarely remembered. Their courage existed not in defiance of command, but in defiance of despair. And yet, those acts of instinct would eventually draw the attention of military scientists. Quietly, without fanfare, the data from field hospitals began shaping new studies on plasma compatibility and cross-type tolerance. What had begun as forbidden improvisation was becoming a question worthy of science itself. That question would reach its most dramatic test in one unforgettable night, when the lines between life, death, and defiance blurred completely. The turning point was coming, and it began with a pulse no one expected to feel again. The night was drenched in cold rain, canvas walls leaked in narrow streams, and the sound of distant artillery rolled through the valley like an unending growl. Inside the dim tent, the air was thick with the smell of ether and burnt cloth. Nurse Lieutenant Claire Whitmore wiped her hands on a blood-stained apron. Her gloves were torn, her uniform soaked through. Private James Rowe lay motionless on the stretcher before her. His body was gray, lips turning blue, pulse absent. The doctor had already moved on to the next case. In the chaos of Anzio's field hospitals, there was no time to mourn, only to move. But Whitmore didn't move. She pressed her stethoscope against his chest again. Nothing. Her fingers brushed the dog tag that hung from his neck. 19 years old. Pennsylvania. Just a boy. She turned toward the next cot. Corporal Ernest Keller. His eyes half open, still conscious, his arm punctured with IV scars. His blood type was marked in ink on his forearm. O positive. Rowe's chart, smudged and nearly unreadable, said A. Under every regulation of military medicine, the transfusion was impossible. Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, Whitmore stared at the last full blood bottle in the ward, labeled for a man who had died minutes ago. It was already beginning to clot. She knew once it did, it would be useless. She also knew that if she didn't act, Rowe's body would be carried to the back within minutes, zipped into the black canvas of finality. Her hand trembled as she reached for the tubing. She worked silently, quickly. A few feet away, another nurse saw and froze, her face pale. "You can't," she whispered. Whitmore didn't answer. In the absence of certainty, instinct became law. She connected the line from Keller's arm to Rowe's, lifted the glass bottle above, and let gravity decide. The blood flowed, dark and heavy, through the line, red against the dull light. Seconds passed, then a minute. Nothing. The tent was silent, except for the sound of rain tapping against canvas. She placed her fingers on Rowe's wrist again. Still nothing. Another 30 seconds. And then, faintly, impossibly, A pulse. Weak, erratic, but there. She froze. The other nurse gasped. Whitmore tightened the clamp slightly, regulating the flow. Rowe's chest rose a little. His skin flushed, faint color returning to his lips. Outside, the shell fire grew louder. A medic ran in, shouting for stretchers. Whitmore ignored him. She leaned close to Rowe's face. The breath was shallow but real. It was working. Somehow, against every rule, every manual, every established law of transfusion, it was working. By dawn, Rowe was alive. Barely. His blood pressure was unstable, his kidneys in danger. But he was breathing. Keller, the donor, remained conscious, weak but stable. Both men would be evacuated 2 days later, neither knowing what risk had bound their fates together. For Whitmore, the hours that followed were a blur of exhaustion and fear. She cleaned the instruments, burned the blood-stained tubing, and rewrote the chart, marking the transfusion as standard issue. There was no space in the record for what she had done. Word spread quietly among the nurses. Some called it a miracle. Others called it madness. But no one reported it. They understood the truth. This act had crossed every line, yet had proven something unthinkable. That under certain conditions, forbidden blood mixing could revive the clinically dead. That night, Whitmore didn't sleep. The tent was quieter now, the battle temporarily distant. She sat outside beneath the weak glow of a lantern, watching the rain bead on her hands. What she had done could cost her everything. But, for the first time in weeks, she had seen life return where death had already claimed its due. And somewhere deep within the command structure of the Allied Medical Corps, that quiet defiance would soon ignite debate and alarm. Because what began as one nurse's instinct would force the military's entire medical establishment to confront the question they were not ready to face. What if the rule itself was wrong? By morning, the field hospital was a tableau of exhaustion. Nurses slumped against tables, surgeons asleep mid-sentence, the floor slick with melted ice and blood. But amid the haze, a single rumor began to circulate. A soldier had been brought back from clinical death. The story spread faster than orders, whispered between cots, carried by medics as both hope and heresy. Lieutenant Whitmore didn't speak of it. She continued her rounds with silent precision, her face unreadable. But by midday, the senior surgeon, Captain Robert Leland, summoned her into the small supply tent that doubled as his office. His tone was calm, his eyes sharp. "They're saying you performed a transfusion without verification," he said quietly. Whitmore stood at attention. "I did what I had to do, sir." "And the result?" "He's alive." Leland paused. The rain outside had stopped, replaced by the distant rumble of trucks, the evacuation convoy. He looked at her, not as an officer, but as a man torn between duty and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" She did. The act violated Articles 12 and 14 of the Army Medical Service Code. Unauthorized medical experimentation and cross-type transfusion without command approval. It could end her service, or worse, label her reckless. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Rowe lived. The chart said he had no pulse at 200 hours. At 0300, he was breathing. That afternoon, the news reached the regional medical headquarters. A formal inquiry was quietly initiated. Officially, there was no accusation, just a review of procedures. But everyone in the hospital knew what it meant. The word forbidden hung in the air heavier than the smoke from the generators. Days passed. Rowe's condition stabilized. He was evacuated to Naples, where laboratory tests confirmed the improbable. His blood now contained mixed cell populations, a mosaic of both A and O types. There was no rejection, no fever, no sign of hemolysis. Somehow, the transfusion had succeeded. Doctors could not explain why. Some speculated the battlefield conditions, cold temperature, slow infusion rate, had mitigated the reaction. Others called it a statistical miracle. The inquiry stalled. No one wanted to punish success, but no one dared to endorse it either. The final report, marked confidential, concluded simply: subject recovered. Procedure unauthorized. No further action recommended. Whitmore was reassigned to a rear hospital in Naples, an unspoken compromise between gratitude and regulation. She was never decorated, never officially cited. Her file remained clean, her action buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. But within the medical corps, her name began to circulate quietly as a symbol, not of rebellion, but of unflinching resolve. Weeks later, at a staff meeting in London, a senior medical officer referenced the case without naming her. "We've received reports," he said, "of cross-type transfusions resulting in survival. Perhaps the science deserves another look." That single line would lead to a series of studies after the war. Investigations into universal plasma substitutes and the mechanisms of cross-matched tolerance. For Whitmore, none of that mattered. She never saw Roe again. But months later, she received a letter, forwarded through military channels, written in shaky handwriting. "Ma'am, they told me I died that night. I don't remember anything. But I'm told you didn't give up. I wanted to say thank you for breaking whatever rule you broke. Pet James Roe." March 1944, the letter was short, but it stayed folded in her uniform pocket until the war's end. In the years that followed, as the guns fell silent and nations began counting their dead, medicine too began counting its lessons. The forbidden act of that night, once condemned, now quietly studied, became the seed of modern emergency transfusion protocols. It would take decades before the medical establishment admitted what the battlefield had already proven: that innovation is often born from disobedience, and progress from courage that defies permission. And while history would not record her name among the generals or heroes, those who worked beside her never forgot the sight of a nurse standing over a lifeless soldier and daring to do the unthinkable, because in that moment, as the blood began to flow from one arm to another, she wasn't just fighting death. She was rewriting what medicine itself believed possible. The immediate aftermath of that night in Anzio rippled quietly through the Allied medical system. Field hospitals, already strained beyond capacity, began to note a curious phenomenon. Soldiers previously declared beyond recovery were stabilizing under conditions previously thought fatal. Some medics attributed it to chance, others to skillful nursing. Few, however, understood that a single forbidden transfusion had revealed a gap in medical knowledge and an opportunity. Across Italy, from Naples to Monte Cassino, reports trickled in of similar improvised procedures. Nurses and corpsmen experimented carefully, documenting what worked and what failed. They did so discreetly. Official records could not sanction cross-type transfusions. Yet the urgency of war left little room for caution. Every man saved meant another soldier could return to the front, another squad could maintain its strength, and another battle might tilt slightly in favor of the Allies. Military doctors began to reconcile theory with practice. They observed that under certain conditions, slow infusion, careful monitoring, and proper donor selection, incompatible transfusions could succeed without immediate fatal reaction. The data were anecdotal at first, hidden in nurses' notes, personal journals, and whispered reports. But collectively, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. Beyond the tactical implications, the human cost was profound. Soldiers like James Roe carried invisible scars, a brush with death that left them physically weaker, mentally shaken, but alive. Nurses, exhausted and often unacknowledged, bore emotional weight as well. They understood that their courage had saved lives, yet each act of defiance came with fear. Fear of reprimand, of court-martial, or of being labeled reckless. Their bravery was invisible to the medals and citations that adorned generals' chests. In military hospitals behind the front lines, The ripple effect began to influence protocol quietly. Rear commanders authorized more flexible use of plasma and encouraged careful monitoring of emergency transfusions, though cross-type procedures remained officially forbidden. Medical supply chains started experimenting with pre-screened universal donors, and research into plasma substitutes accelerated. What had been a desperate gamble in a mud-soaked tent was now informing systematic study. The ripple reached scientific circles after the war as well. Reports compiled from field experiences, combined with laboratory analysis, highlighted the need for improved blood storage, rapid transfusion techniques, and methods to prevent immune rejection. These findings would later influence modern trauma protocols, the development of emergency blood banks, and even policies for civilian hospital transfusions. But perhaps the most lasting impact was philosophical. The story of a nurse willing to risk everything to save a single soldier challenged rigid hierarchies. It demonstrated that human judgment, grounded in observation and experience, could sometimes surpass textbook knowledge. It forced a reconsideration of what rules in medicine were truly immutable, and which were flexible in the face of human life. In those early months following Anzio, whispers of the forbidden transfusions circulated quietly among nurses and doctors. They were never formally praised. Yet, for every life preserved, for every pulse restored, the impact was tangible. The war would continue to rage, and many more would die. But a lesson had been learned, one born of courage, intuition, and the refusal to let procedure outweigh humanity. As months turned into years, the story of the Anzio transfusion became emblematic of the hidden evolution of wartime medicine. Though the official reports never named Lieutenant Whitmore or detailed her actions, the cumulative data from field hospitals shaped policy in subtle but profound ways. The Allied Medical Corps quietly began studying the limits of cross-type transfusions, noting survival rates, adverse reactions, and best practices. These studies laid the groundwork for what would later become universal donor protocols and rapid battlefield resuscitation techniques used in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Soldiers who had survived such interventions often carried more than scars. They carried gratitude and an unspoken bond with the nurses who risked everything to keep them alive. Letters arrived years later from men like James Rowe, chronicling their disbelief and thanks. These personal testimonies, preserved in archives, revealed the psychological impact of survival. Hope renewed in the most harrowing of circumstances, a recognition of human courage that transcended orders and regulations. The broader medical community began to acknowledge the necessity of field improvisation. In post-war reports, Dr. Charles Drew and other leading transfusion experts cited frontline experiences as critical to understanding the practical applications of blood storage and plasma. What had once been considered reckless, mixing blood types, rapid infusion without verification, became a foundation for controlled experimentation. Techniques once whispered about in tents were studied in hospitals, formalized into safe procedures, and eventually integrated into civilian emergency care. Ethically, the war prompted reflection on the boundaries of medical authority. Field nurses and medics had consistently faced the dilemma of obeying the rules versus saving life. Their choices challenged the prevailing notion that strict adherence to protocol was always correct. Over time, military manuals were revised to provide more autonomy to medics in emergencies, acknowledging that judgment calls made in extremis could save lives without undermining discipline. The physical aftermath of these transfusions also became a subject of study. Some soldiers experienced mild complications, kidney stress, minor fever, temporary hemolysis, but survival far outweighed risk. In later decades, medical historians would trace the origins of modern trauma resuscitation and universal donor programs back to these improvised interventions. It became clear that necessity in wartime medicine accelerated innovation in ways peacetime science could not replicate. The story also highlighted the human cost of bureaucratic invisibility. Nurses who had saved lives often received no formal recognition. Their heroism existed in private letters, oral histories, and quietly shared anecdotes among peers. Yet this invisibility did not diminish the moral weight of their acts. For every soldier who returned from near death, a nurse had defied fear, regulation, and exhaustion to rewrite what was possible in medicine. Ultimately, the forbidden transfusions of Anzio and similar field innovations were more than medical interventions. They were acts of courage, empathy, and defiance that bridged the gap between science and humanity. They forced the Allied military, and later the global medical community, to confront the limits of established knowledge, and to accept that progress often begins with a single, daring act. ChatGPT said, "The story of that rain-soaked night in Anzio is not merely a tale of medicine or war. It is a reflection on the fragility and resilience of life, and the quiet courage that often goes unnoticed." One nurse, faced with a choice that defied orders and risked everything, reminded the world that human instinct can sometimes surpass rigid protocol, and that the preservation of life may demand bravery beyond the battlefield. In the decades that followed, the lessons of that night shaped modern medicine. Universal donor programs, rapid transfusion protocols, and emergency trauma care all owe a debt to the improvisation and intuition of nurses and medics who worked under fire. What had been forbidden in the chaos of war became the foundation of life-saving practice, proving that innovation often emerges from necessity, and that ethical courage can coexist with scientific rigor. Beyond the science, there is a philosophical truth. War exposes the extremes of human experience, where rules and regulations are tested against instinct and conscience. The Anzio transfusion shows that in moments of crisis, the measure of heroism is not in rank or recognition, but in the willingness to act when inaction guarantees death. Lieutenant Whitmore's story also speaks to the enduring human spirit. Every pulse restored, every soldier revived, was a testament to the empathy and tenacity that defines the best of humanity. It reminds us that even amidst destruction, there are acts of quiet heroism, decisions made in fleeting seconds, that can alter the course of lives and, ultimately, the course of history. In the end, the forbidden blood mix was more than a medical procedure. It was a profound act of defiance against despair, a bridge between the possible and the impossible, and a lasting lesson that courage, compassion, and ingenuity are often the true instruments that shape our world. The pulse that returned that night continues to echo, not just in history books, but in every life-saving decision made under impossible circumstances.